The concept of law and order has been prevalent since ancient times, with the simple solution of having a third person solve the problem for two people. With the development of civilizations, the concept of a judge or judiciary became more prominent for decision making purposes. It was common to have a king pass judgments, but it didn't always work. It eventually came down to the king's whims and fancies. To circumvent this problem, councils were created to pass judgments on behalf of the king, but again, they all had the same problem. They needed rules, rules for the systematic functioning of the government, rules which applied to everybody, rules which were easy to follow. The logic behind this is simple. If you have a set of rules, you follow them, and from there you get to a certain decision. But there was a problem. Rules did not always translate to decisions. It also came down to how you interpreted those rules, and the interpretation is what brought biases in. A modern day judiciary in our democracy is a very complex setup. We have multiple courts, multiple trials, and within a single court, you have a lot of decision making aspects, starting from judges, lawyers, witnesses, all the way to jurors who come up with the final verdict. Within this complex setup, let's have a look at the different aspects of decision making in state and federal courts. We start at the very top of the pile, judges. Judges are the primary decision makers in a court and they maintain close control over the court proceedings. An ideal judge is expected to be impartial and interpret the law based on his vast experience without getting biased. Judges actually go through rigorous training as well as have vast experience which enables them to prevent bias from creeping in. However, implicit bias is always a concern and difficult to deal with, especially if they get emotional or sympathize with one of the parties.
I hereby order you to serve 2 life sentences back to back, one for each of your victims. So be it.
Number two, witnesses. Witnesses are a critical aspect of our judicial system and have the power to change the course of a trial based on their testimony. It is important to note that witnesses are not limited to those who were on the crime scene. Rather, anybody who was at the witness stand is considered as a witness. Several biases can creep in here, which makes the difference between what happened versus what the witness thinks happened. One of the most common biases in this context is the aptly named testimonial bias. Witnesses do tend to fill in the gaps in their memory and make up a story which may not be entirely true. This is not their fault, this is how they actually remember the sequence of events from what they saw. Therein lies the gap between what actually happened versus what actually they have seen. Other witnesses who are much more professional, such as police officers or forensic witnesses, have a different issue. They face issues with complexity bias, overlooking certain information, ignoring certain information, and being under a lot of pressure because of caseloads and so on and so forth. Despite not being related to testimony, how I look, how I appear is something which does count in the court. For example, what I'm wearing right now is probably okay. Basically, not looking like this or like this. Moving on to our most critical component, the jury.
Here's how jury selection works. First, prospective jurors are picked for duty out of a large pool, usually a list of registered voters or licensed drivers. Then comes a process called voir dire, or to speak the truth. Prospective jurors are questioned by lawyers on both sides. They're looking for bias. Like in this scene in The Devil's Advocate, where a lawyer is trying to gauge the jury for bias against bankers.
Do you think as a juror, you would be able to set aside any prior opinion you might hold about the savings and loan industry?
If a lawyer has reason to believe a juror will be biased, they can ask the judge to dismiss the juror with cause.
As an average citizen, the juror is not trained like the judge to work against biases. This essentially means that a juror can fall prey to different types of biases, which in turn can affect their final verdict. These things are definitely troublesome when you think about it. However, on the positive side, the group effect also plays a major role in getting the verdict right. You may have one or two jurors who succumb to certain biases, but the rest of the group can usually reason with them and bring them out of it. Our last aspect of focus is on emotion and delivery. At the end of the day, just having information and witnesses is not enough. What it comes down to is how it is presented to the jurors and the judge. This is where delivery comes into the picture. Delivery plays a major role in terms of memory biases, primarily because at the end of the day, jurors remember if something was done very well or if there was something unique about the way things were presented. At the end of the day, it's impossible to remove all types of biases from our judicial system. We accept the system because it's not perfect, but because it is the ideal system under the current circumstance and it's the best solution that we have as a democracy for solving disputes. Having said that, it's not always necessary that we have to remove these biases. After all, the jurors that we have are a representation of us, and if we as a society are biased, then why not the jurors themselves? So I leave it to you as potential jurors to consider at what point should we stop worrying about biases, but at the same time not succumb to them and allow them to change our verdict. And now let's progress to the activity at hand.